your work with your work is now you're working here at LSBU, Igea, and what were some of the? How did you get here? Where did you teach architecture before, and actually, like, what brought you to architecture in the first place?
Okay, so I probably wasn't thinking of becoming an architect, although I was very interested in art history when I was at school. My father was a brick manufacturer, and so I come from a family of 2 daughters, and I was actually thinking of doing something like sociology or social work, but because I was quite academically strong, he felt I should do something different. And he suggested I studied architecture.
Your father?
Yeah, so I did. I actually went and studied architecture, and I enjoyed my architectural education, although I would say it was challenging because there weren't many women in my year. It was predominantly men. And I first started studying, I'm Australian, I started studying at the Queensland University of Technology, and then for my equivalent master's or part 2, I moved to Melbourne to the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology. And I actually practiced as an architect for a long time, well, until I had a child. And I worked overseas in Germany, post-war reconstruction, essentially sort of always socially oriented. The practices I worked for in Melbourne, because I studied while I did my part 2, they were doing, I was working on things like care homes or community centres or things like that. And then I got into university work, so I was working as project architect on university projects. And when I was in Germany, I worked on hospitals, infrastructural work. I decided to go back to Australia because I wanted to have a family, and started a practice there. And then when I had my daughter, I fell pregnant and was working for an architect, and he said to me, I either had to come back to work for him as a senior architect in 6 weeks, or I wouldn't have a job. And so I thought, well, actually, I think I'd rather just spend time with my daughter. So my husband and I started our own practice, and I then got into academic life. So I was doing this sort of working in practice, and then teaching, tutoring in design studio, essentially. And after doing that in Australia and getting into research, I then thought I'd come and work in England for a few years. I didn't think it would be too long, and now I've stayed 20 years. So I was working at a couple of universities in Australia before I came here. And then since I've been in the UK, I worked at Oxford Brookes. I worked for the University of Liverpool at their Shanghai campus, it's outside Suzhou, so I was a dean for them. And then I came back because of COVID and was at the University of Plymouth. And then when I was at Plymouth, I was poached for this job at South Bank, asked if I'd be the head of school here.
Wow.
So yeah, it's been kind of, I was at Oxford for quite a while and then have moved more frequently, but I'm very happy here at South Bank.
And how did you? You're in Australia. You and your husband set up your practice. How did you get into academia? Was it kind of an incidental thing, or was it purposeful?
No, completely. Because I was academic, just naturally. He suggested while we had our practice, why don't I just do some tutoring just to supplement things? Because we had our own practice, which was out of our house, essentially. And I had a baby that I was looking after. And he said, well, why not do some tutoring and see how it feels? Because it might be nice just to connect in other networks. And I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed the teaching. I was very fortunate to be mentored by some great people when I was teaching there. Someone who I devote my latest book to is a professor of modern architectural history. Her name's Jennifer Taylor. And she convinced me to do a PhD with her. And she was a great mentor for me, actually, my whole life until she passed away.
That's amazing. And I mean, so we met about 2 years ago. It was at the London Build conference. And it was just by chance that I had just set up my studio at the time, my architectural storytelling studio. And then I approached you after, I think it was a panel discussion on women in architecture. And it was just, I had no idea who you were, but it just so happened that you'd actually published work on filmmaking in architecture. tell us about the book. Like, what instigated it, what motivated it, and what was your first experience with bringing the world of film and architecture together?
So after I'd finished my PhD, I was kind of bored because I had been working full time. I had one child, and I was doing my PhD kind of in the mornings or after work. So when my PhD finished, I had this kind of vacuum. And I knew of an Australian architect, his name's Stuart Mackintosh. He had designed some fantastic buildings in Melbourne, but he was very unknown. And he was living in the city that I was living in at the time, which was Brisbane in Australia. And I thought I would just call him up and see if I could do a historiography of him, because my PhD is in modern architectural history, so I was trained as a historian. And when I started to interview him, I would go to his house, go through his archive. He had a very extensive archive of all of his projects. And he was a very animated and, I would say, interactive person. He did a lot of gestures, he would sigh a lot, he would kind of stoop, he'd sort of he'd put his hands out. And I was thinking, I'm going to be writing a history of this man's work. And actually, I can't capture him. So at the time, we had moved our architectural practice from our house into an arts building that we were actually working on. So we had a studio in an arts building called Metro Arts. And there were some filmmakers and artists. There were lots of different sorts of artists in there, but there were filmmakers in there.
This was a studio with your husband?
Yes, with my husband. That was an architectural practice, but basically I commissioned a script writer. He had worked in the theatre, and he'd made films to work with me on just making a film of Stuart Mackintosh.
What made you want to go for a script writer?
I actually knew him because we'd run some consultation with him in the building, because we were looking at how to design an arts facility that would be inclusive of all arts practices. It was funded by Gough Whitlam in Australia, who was a very Labor and Liberal-centred politician and supporting the arts. And I'd worked a lot in consultation with the people in the building, so I knew him. And he was very funny, and I thought he was very good, and he was a real pleasure to work with. So he and I made the film on his Mac, and he edited it, and I'd never made a film before, so I learned how to edit with him. We sat down together, we did all the filming together, and then we did the editing together. And I've sort of worked that way ever since.
Wow. And what is that first experience of editing, building a story, how do you see any, obviously you've written, about this, but what in your mind is the kind of connection there with the storytelling aspect within architecture, whether it be a pin-up of a project or when you're talking to a client in practice and you're kind of telling them the story of a project? Yeah, what's the similarities there?
I think for me, and my PhD was about trying to integrate people who were marginalised in architectural history and had never been represented. And the only way you can find out who came up with a theory about architecture or who contributed to it is by getting into a personal biography. You can't understand the backstory of who visits a building and is inspired by a building to then talk to other people to then come up with an alternative theory. So much of my PhD was about an intersection between the personal biography and the professional in architecture. But I was very interested in the way friendships and social networks construct knowledge. And so biography has always been something I've been very interested in. I need to understand someone's biography to understand the DNA of why they work on what they work on, why they're interested in what they're interested in, how that journey builds up a kind of body of work, how it helps them, who they work with that gives them the inspiration, and who slows them down. So biographies are very much about obstacles and opportunities, I would say.
That's so interesting. So actually, you're sort of saying that in order to understand like a movement or kind of the wider picture, you have to understand the human story or the personal story behind it.
And I'll give an example of it. For a long time, when I was at Oxford Brookes, I taught architectural history, an architectural history course. And I always taught it through the biography of the architects that I was talking about in that period. So for instance, I think of Mies van der Rohe through the relationships that he has with Lilly Reich in Germany. And then when he detaches from Lilly Reich and moves to the US, you understand that body of work when he starts to collaborate with Philip Johnson. But the meeting of Philip Johnson, when he is moving around Europe with Hitchcock, essentially trying to work out the content of the book of the International Style of Modern Architecture. Philip Johnson meets Mies, he's interested in Mies, but he doesn't like Lilly Reich. And Mies makes the decision if he's going to emigrate to the US, he's going to leave Lilly Reich behind and he's going to start a new future. And he literally, you see a kind of transformation in the work. So I think the biography helps you to understand the focus on detail that Mies had, for instance, which she very much has. And it's that kind of insight, I think, into the people that help make your DNA as an architect that is very important. So the narrative for me is always vital, the story behind who you meet, your decisions you make as a consequence, and the clients you get to meet and the opportunities you have.
That's so interesting because I think, I remember from university learning about these figures, these larger than life architects, or even if we're talking about like musicians or whatever it might be, and you always look at it through the lens of their work and how their work changes. But actually, I mean, it sounds kind of obvious what you're saying now, that actually studying the person gives you the deeper reasoning behind some of those changes. Whereas looking at the projects, I suppose, just on their own almost feels a little bit superficial because you're not getting to the heart of the person.
Well, I also think it doesn't explain the connections between different styles in architecture, for instance, because they are very personally interwoven. Somebody meets somebody else in person, or they have the opportunity to meet an architect who they might disagree with, and then they come up with an alternative kind of architecture. So it's very personally networked. The social production of architecture, which is what I write about really, is very much the explanation for why we have the history of architecture that we have in my study in that modern period. I've never gone beyond that, I will say that. But
why not?
Well, because I haven't looked at the other periods, so I can only talk about the ones that I can say, yes, the Smithsons met Corbusier, and while they adored him, they also had very many things which they objected to, which was a lack of social commitment in the work that he was producing in the high-rise towers. So it was like those kind of personal encounters that if I could find them out for every architect, then it would help me understand that. But it was just a sort of small period post-war that I did in my PhD.
Post-war, okay.
Yeah. Just to go back to your question, I actually get really annoyed in architecture that people only always want to talk about buildings. I find it extremely unhelpful to only talk about the structure of a building, to only talk about the aesthetic of a building, to talk about it through a lens, whatever it might be. Because I think you get a much deeper understanding of something if you understand how it emerged. And those social constructions are the architectural constructions. They have a direct relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. And it becomes a combination of taste otherwise almost, as opposed to something deeper. Do you like this or do you not like this? What's your rationale for that? But actually, when you understand the deeper reasoning, it can help to guide your sense of taste and aesthetic and all the other stuff much better if you understand the person and their motivations.
I think there is something, though, in my PhD which was pretty fundamental to me. It was because I was trying to understand the relationships where people worked very collaboratively and then where they didn't. And that was quite important for me, as understanding the nature of architectural work. And with that comes friendships, people who are the mentor to somebody else. And they develop very strong friendships. They tend to like the same kind of architecture. They tend to mirror one another. So they tend to have the same kind of politics. They can identify with one another, even if they're a different age, even if They might sometimes come from very different backgrounds, but there's something in their very essential DNA which is very similar. And so that will develop a style, because those two people believe in the thing that they're working towards, and then they work against their enemies to prove that that style of architecture is actually much more valid in the period of time in which they're operating. So Zaha Hadid's a perfect example, obsessed with the work of the Russian constructivists and the suprematists, taught by Rem Koolhaas, who's obsessed with the Russian constructivists and the suprematists. And so in an essential, which is the kind of rationale of that thinking that then binds them. People are bound by the things that they share in common, I would say. There's a shared space. And I've extended it beyond that thinking, because then I was only looking at architectural history. But I think there's something demographic in that study, because it can surpass gender, it can surpass cultural background. It's a lot easier if you're the same in many characteristics, but it certainly doesn't exclude similarity when the characteristics are different.
It's interesting because we're sort of almost talking now about, we've got kind of gone more into the personalities of people. But that is really the root of it. So I completely agree that that's the heart. What I'm interested in is, have you ever come across any situation where the two people who are collaborating have opposing or different views, but somehow are still able to work together? Or is that something that is quite rare, do you say?
No, absolutely. And I think it's quite common. They're not exactly the same. They will actually, so when I study the Smithsons, for instance, Alison Smithson's very strong, extremely assertive. I never met her, but it doesn't matter what record you have of her as a person. She's an extremely strong woman. Peter Smithson, much more gentle, much more perhaps amiable, you would say. But at their core, they had the same values about, they both come from Northern England, they study in Newcastle, they both believe in housing for everyone. They're working on low-income housing for people from working class backgrounds that they both know. And they have that very shared space, but between them, they're very different people, how they project themselves externally, their friends' networks. She's much more of a writer than he is. She writes and is actually kind of editing all the transcripts for Team 10 that then flip. So they have different skills which complement one another. But I think at the core, they both believe in exactly the same things about an architecture that's very reductive, that kind of can be built for everyone. And so there's something which is almost, I think, there tends to be a political similarity. You have a shared politics, that you can trust that person, that your politics won't be undermined.
Mm-hmm. And then the other sort of things almost become secondary in a way.
Well, I think they just grow from that ground. And perhaps having somebody say to you, well, actually, what's a different way we can look at this, or challenging it, allows it to have an energy that drives the direction. So I think the kind of, debating about a topic and questioning somebody else's ideas is a very healthy way of doing it if you respect the other person. And you'll always have that if you have the same political ground.
Yeah, amazing. That's really interesting. And you were talking about sort of minorities, and this is something that you looked at in your PhD. And earlier we were talking, and you were telling me about the fact that you're on the Women in Architecture panel, or you're the...
Oh no, I was the chair. So
the chair, sorry.
I stepped down from that role. Yeah, I was. But I've been parts of other networks. I've always studied gender in architecture. Obviously because there were so few women in my year that it was a particular kind of experience. And not many of us became architects, actually. And then there were challenges even when I was doing my part 2 of people just dropping out. So I've always been involved in women's networks and writing about women architects. I've sort of brought in other things over the years which are about class. I'm very interested in class. I come from a working class family who were migrants. My father was a direct migrant in his 20s. My mother's grandfather migrated to Australia, so I'm of migrant background. and a minority in Australia. So, grew up with eating food that people didn't eat, Italian food. When I went to school, it was always kind of shunned upon. Which sounds curious now because obviously it's all very standard. But, if my mother made me something which was an Italian in my lunchbox, like aubergine, people would go on and on about how disgusting it was.
I know the feeling.
Exactly. You know what I'm talking about. So I just think, oh my God, I'd rather have that than just like a cheese sandwich.
You want to feel like you're part of the group, and you don't want to feel like you're otherized,
Yeah, and not felt that I had bad experiences at school, because actually I was with lots of other people from other mixed backgrounds, because Australia is extremely multicultural. But, it was always kind of like that dominating perspective that things should perhaps have an Anglo-Saxon direction. And, I think there's a great deal to be valued from the UK. I like a lot of things about England that I can say I value, but I also think that a mixture of people is very healthy. And I really I get a lot of energy out of diverse perspectives of things. So in terms of my work, that's kind of gone more into, well, it's already been about minorities, to be honest. It's just gone into different minorities. That work has gone into trying to so, people would say to me, typically you'd say, well, you're of Italian background, so you should only write about people from Italian background. I don't really feel that's particularly helpful to me. I wouldn't say, I don't identify.
People say that to you.
Well, they kind of do, because they think that's your familiar territory. But I wouldn't say it was. I think I can probably quite happily sit with anybody from any background. And I really love food. I love food from different countries. I'm happy to try anything, anywhere, wherever I am. I love culture, as we've become, because my father travelled a lot. We travelled a lot. And so I was...
With it around, near Australia, or...?
Just generally. So my father would come... So the first time I went to Italy, I was 3, and my dad took us... So he comes from the Adriatic coast of Italy, and my mother's family is quite close, the adjacent state. But we would go up to northern Italy to look at architecture, and he took us to the Duomo. I remember I thought, that's the most amazing thing I've ever seen in my life. The Duomo in Milan was just, to me, incredible building. And so, but wherever we would come every 3 years to visit my grandparents in Italy, because my dad has 2 siblings, and they would rotate, so they would come out for their families, which is typical kind of migrant thing to do, is to keep connections. But every time we'd either go through New York, Europe, and various, wherever he wanted to go. And he travelled a lot for his own work, as well as with us as a family. So I feel that kind of cultural interest was always there. And then in architecture, I guess I'm very happy for people to bring... I don't have the position that you have to take something out of somebody to acculturate them into architecture. I think what you have to do is find what's in them and let them develop that to make a kind of architecture maybe that we don't know. I mean, I think there's something very, through this personal acculturation, that you can say about architecture, depending on what you've seen and what you're interested in and what you've been exposed to. And so I think that's a really important feature of not trying to standardize everybody, not trying to normalize everybody.
How much of that diversity do you think is attributed to cultural background, or let's say ethnic background or whatever? And I completely associate with the going back, because my family's Pakistani, and every summer my mum would take us back to Islamabad, Pakistan. Islamabad famously was master planned by Doxiadis, the Greek master planner, and it's quite a new city. I mean, it was designed in the 60s, so it's very interesting, and so we always have that connection every summer. So it is very much, it's interesting to hear it from a more European context, Italian context. But how much of that diversity that you're talking about bringing into architecture do you see as cultural, ethnic kind of background versus diversity of thought, or let's say political differences? Because one thing I found that's so interesting to me is that within, let's say, the Pakistani community, is that I always thought, well, politically we must be fairly similar. And I think I was maybe 15 or 16 when I realized, having discussions even within my own family, that thought that we think so differently on certain topics, on certain political topics. So how much of that is sort of homogenized within a culture, or how much difference do you see even within cultures of bringing that in? Or is that actually what you're also talking about? Is that those differences, those political differences?
I think that growing up in Australia, and I guess when I went to school, so I went to an all-girls Catholic school. Well, actually, pretty well most of my education was in that terrain. But people came from everywhere, but I didn't really notice it. I mean, I did with the lunches. Let's say, eating that different food, I realized. But it wasn't a big deal for me. It wasn't something that was significant. And it was only when I got to university that I started to, it really kind of, I kind of thought, oh, such and such was actually German. And it sort of made a difference to me. There was something that happened there where I understood that. But when I was growing up, it really didn't matter. When I went to somebody's house, I was just eating whatever they ate and enjoying it and enjoying understanding their cultural perspective. I would say for me, that kind of just acceptance, it applies to everything of like different political values. I'm quite happy to have a debate with somebody about quite right-wing things. I'm not a right-wing person, but I think I've probably even become more open to that as I got older, trying to understand, how does somebody have that political position? How do they take that position? How did that come about? Why do they value that and not understand something else? So I've been I read a lot of political philosophy at the best of times, so it's quite important for me. Then when that applies itself into architecture, not everybody has that capacity. Not everyone has the capacity to just say, you're different, that's okay. People actually, and I find working here, it's, because this is the most diverse place I've ever worked in as an architecture school, and I'm extremely happy in it. I would say I really enjoy it. I love the students, I love the staff. I love the fact that we can talk about different things openly. Within all of that is the kind of question of being respectful in how you talk to one another, how you just let somebody say what they want to say, and the language you use, because I can still object to what you're saying, but it's how I say it and how I articulate. But I need you to think about that, or I want you to question that, or I want you to open up a kind of different way of positioning it. So I think for me, it's not that people can't have different politics, but it's like, how do you talk to somebody about political ambitions in relation to architecture, but also within an ethical framework? I think I have a pretty distinct position on ethics, because I've worked with a lot of people who haven't been ethical. I think that makes you kind of know what you never ever should do.
Yeah, that's very true. I know where you're coming from, but and you're right. It's something that not everyone is capable of, even with outside of architecture. Some people aren't capable of having those conversations, and it's a tricky one. You have to be careful, how you approach it. Do you think, you were talking about you went to an all-girls Catholic school, and although there were different backgrounds, different diversities, you never noticed it. Is it, in your mind, is this a sign of a good school, a good upbringing? Because I went to a Church of England school, and I was the only Muslim in fact, I might have been the first Muslim there, but I was definitely the only Muslim in my year. And I remember, we used to have religious lessons, and Islam and Christianity are very similar, so, there was never really much conflict in the belief. But the thing I loved the most, and I remember it now, and this is when I was like 7 or 8 years old, is my teachers who were Christian, who were Catholic, were very kind of adamant that you should never discriminate against anyone. And it was never an issue. Like I had, my friends never had any issues with me regarding, the fact that you eat differently. I mean, sometimes there was comments and things, but nothing bigger, nothing huge, nothing major. Yeah. Do you think this is something that comes from your schooling, maybe?
Well, I think the biggest thing I took from my schooling was just to read, like Catholic nuns read, and they throw stuff at you. The more you read, the more they throw at you. So I would say my whole schooling was just about pushing into me the importance of reading things and keeping myself up to date with things. I think there is a respectfulness in the value system, but there's also a huge amount of discrimination in the Catholic Church as well, outside of that. But I was very fortunate. The people that taught me, I think, were really good at giving me that value set. So I'm not sure if that answers the question, to be honest.
No, it's a bit of a weird question, but it's just something that I remember from my upbringing too. The level of tolerance that because I've also been to a school that wasn't tolerant after that, and I have seen the difference that has made.
I know, absolutely, and I think that question of tolerance was very much in there, and I think it is an important thing. But I'm not a practicing Catholic. I don't believe in it. When I left uni, I think there are so many problematic issues in there, but at its core, I totally am on board with everybody having a place and being equal and being respected within a canon. So I'm good with that. I probably carry a philosophy, but not the other features of it. Yeah, I was also going to talk about, through Women in Architecture, through a connection at the Cardiff University, I was introduced to one of the team of women in architecture in Pakistan. And so I hadn't really been doing any work in women's groups with particular demographic groups before, I would say. It would have been more generally women of any background. And when I started to work on this project, we organised a Voices of Women in Architecture conference here at South Bank. And we then heard testimonies of women in Lahore and in India, in wider Pakistan, and then also people of South Asian background in the UK, to try to understand what the difference was in their class, their experiences. It was very much biographical. People were speaking about their experiences of where they went to school and how that came about in framing how they understand things. And the work that I subsequently done from that is really interesting, because people who went to either schools that were Anglican or Church of England, with Protestant, doesn't really matter, but they're kind of in a mixed cultural background. They're much more capable of being able to understand multiple worlds, I think, and then operate in them. And so even in this research, it's quite interesting how when they talk about when they were at school, how that understanding that they were still allowed to be themselves, but they were in a school that actually had a different belief system, but they were still allowed to, in this instance, continue with their Muslim beliefs. So yeah, I think that's something very interesting about how that synthesizes over time. Some of them decided to stay in England, they'd gone to English schools, came here, work here in practice, but then they kind of carry a bit of both worlds in themselves.
How interesting. So do you think religion is sort of a factor in the way people kind of, with your work with women in architecture, other minorities, do you think religion plays a factor in their experience?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's your values. It's kind of, how you live, isn't it? The political, the social values you have, the religious values you have. If somebody doesn't have any religious values, that's fine. That's not a factor to be engaging with. But if they do, then it's how do you understand that, and how do you respect that that's just the background they came from, and that's what they're dealing with. And I guess my interest in women of South Asian background that moved to the UK is a bit like, my mother was Australian born, but she's of Italian descent. But actually she's very Australian. So you can get acculturated very quickly in many ways. And so what are you picking up and what are you leaving behind? And I'm very interested in that, and then how that develops in your practice, because it sort of moves a lot of the time towards social responsibility. It's not really common in the research I've done to date to find women who don't have a social perspective on things. I mean, generally you can say there is that commonality, but some people will say they do it, but not actually do it. They can be quite exclusive, and others actually live it, and they live it in the work they produce.
Live what?
They live a kind of social responsibility to enabling people of all groups, not just an elite group in architecture.
And why do you think it is that it's women, like you say, have this kind of social, have views that they've got on society based on your work?
Well, I don't think all women share it anymore. I would have said that different generations, and I just delivered a paper on the weekend, which was about this. I think people of my generation, there wouldn't be any question that all women shared support for other women. But I think it is changing as women are more compromised in perhaps more corporate or business challenging perspectives. They can sometimes be less supportive of social issues and more business oriented. But I think generally most women were supportive of other women because we're kind of gender stereotyped, caring. You know, that's the kind of thing maybe our mothers and our fathers carry on to us. I can't say that for sure, but I think there is a different DNA in the way that we're nurtured. I'm not saying that there aren't socially responsible men or people who don't even identify with a gender, but I think for women it's more of a stereotypical construction of how girls are raised. And also because we essentially mothered until men or non-binary people mothered and parented, you know. That was kind of the main game, wasn't it, for women? If you chose to have children, you have a different attitude to how you work.
Earlier we were talking about, this kind of alludes to this, what we were talking about earlier with some hierarchy we were talking about in the profession. And yeah, what would you say, does this conversation about, you know, women, does it sort of fit into that?
Yeah, oh, definitely. When we did the Voices of Women in Architecture event with South Asian women, Sumita Singer gave a keynote address, and it was a really important address, actually. She wrote the paper about her personal experiences as a woman, and she talked about there being a pecking order within women, just as there are a pecking order in male architects. And it goes to which university did you go to? Did you go to an elite one or a non-elite one? So there's an immediate pecking order in that. What's your family background? You know, economically, there's a pecking order. Then she was talking about a pecking order from women of European or white background to women who don't. And I was thinking it's such an interesting thing to be thinking about the power networks of even within architecture where women had more prominent positions of power, that there still exist pecking orders. And I know we're moving in different direction and it is changing. I'm not saying that it isn't, but I still think that there is a pecking order within the power relations of how people engage with one another, or who has more power.
And is this specifically for women, or like you said earlier, there's also the same thing on the men's side? And is it the same sort of factors? Is it, you know, university, what class, what background you come from?
Absolutely. I think the reason why I focus on women is because I've been researching them for a long time. If I'd been doing research on men for 30 years, I would quite happily speak with some kind of authority in the area. I can't do that. But I can certainly say that I have understood that there are men who are equally discriminated against in the workplace, just as women have been. So, you know, that does happen, and the power relations are significant. I think, from my personal opinion, it does come from the universities that you come from. They hold the most power that generates the students with the most power. There is a lineage that happens, so there's no coincidence that the AA produced or has produced some of the most significant architects in England, because they're in social networks where they have opportunities. They come from incomes where there are more possibilities for them to even be studying internationally. You know, there's the correlation can be quite simple, is that the quality of, but that's not exclusive to say that other universities aren't going to give you an equally good in education, but I think it's harder. I mean, here, it's a lot harder for us to support our students with all the challenges they have, because then they're coming from a different starting point, many of them, not all of them. We have students of very different demographic backgrounds. But for those with real challenges, I mean, we have single parent mothers who are apprentices working in offices. We're dealing with a very different student and trying to give them an optimal architectural education. And it's the same education, but we're working with very different DNA of a person to try and get them the best knowledge and skills that they can have. So, yeah.
I mean, I think I already know the answer to this, but compared to Liverpool, compared to Oxford, Oxford Brookes, what is it? You said earlier you love working at London South Bank. With these sorts of challenges, what is it about London South Bank that you love compared to the other places you worked or taught?
I think one big factor for me is the staff. The staff are extremely diverse. And while they might have gone, so some of them they are graduates of London South Bank, they themselves were quite marginalised. So they very much identify with the students that we teach. But other people like me that come from other countries, where our experiences are different, but we're also very good at engaging with people from vast backgrounds, socially, economically as well, Sometimes you work with people who are from middle class and upper class backgrounds in your workplace, and that kind of, I think the biggest thing for me is that sometimes when people haven't been exposed to something, they don't understand it because they can't see it, so you can talk to them endlessly about it, but they don't have a connection with it because they don't understand it. So I remember, and a perfect example of this, when I was at Oxford Brookes, I was doing research for many years with my husband. So we have a practice in Oxford, which he primarily runs. I'm no longer a part of that because I've taken this kind of academic side more. But when we were at Brookes, we were doing studios on unfinished buildings. And I remember having this very curious conversation with someone who said to me, why would you work with a building that hadn't been finished? Why wouldn't you just build a new one? It's the kind of idea that actually questions of waste, questions of access to money. I was kind of thinking, okay, social responsibility to having something which is the basis of a building that you could do other things with, It's a kind of conscience about understanding access to wealth, isn't it?
Yes.
And some of the people and I'm not saying it was criticism of that person that said it to me, they just didn't have any clue. They just didn't think that would be a relevant thing to be working on. It just didn't feature in their mind. It was just like, why don't you just knock it down, sup, or something new? And I think that kind of attitude is a little bit of it. If you have an awareness because you've been exposed to something, it then means that you are frugal. Very good if you don't have any money. When you operate as an architect, you operate frugally. You probably have a accentuated business position on how to really maximize things and do things resourcefully. But if you're a bit more luxurious, you might not have the skill set to manage that. I'm not saying they definitely correlate, but there can sometimes be a correlation.
Yeah, and I mean, coming from Sheffield, having studied at Sheffield, I did my undergrad and my postgrad there. And you'll know this because you did some external examining there, but there's a very strong social agenda, and one of the key things that we looked at is how can you repurpose buildings, how can you retrofit buildings, and I think this is a conversation that is becoming much more prominent now, with this idea that in the future we may not be so much building new buildings as opposed to repurposing old ones.
Absolutely, and we did studios on it for a long time, and some people thought it was interesting and others took value out of it. And then we'd already been doing studios on it before the unfinished Biennale exhibition that was run by Spain. We'd been doing work in Spain at the time, actually. But yeah, I think it's a changing culture. But that's my point about a kind of sense of being frugal or being raised to be frugal, or maybe thinking differently about money or about opportunities.
Do you think, when you say raised to be frugal, do you think that there's a sort of mindset that immigrants bring, or people of immigrant background, where there is this sense of not being overly opulent. Not that people who are not immigrants are like that, but I mean, from my experience, there's this within my own upbringing, there's a much more of a awareness of resource.
Well, my generation, because as you start to make money, then it changes for subsequent generations. But I think in the first scenario where people are arriving sometimes to a country with nothing, and they don't have any skills, and they're just doing manual work, it's a very different kind of issue of climbing the ladder, and how do you navigate that to somebody who does have networks and does have skills, and then how they manage those resources and, I guess, assets that they built up over time. So each generation then has an alternative version of that that I think changes, those value systems change. But at its core, when people are low income and they're struggling with having to manage their own resources, they carry that in their personal life, and then their values sort of mutate a little bit in the generation, if they have children, into something different, because they may have a slightly different version of that, and their subsequent children, if they have them, will have a slightly different one. I think it depends on how much you've had to do it on your own or with little.
Do you think because in England, we as we know, the main kind of waves of immigration happened post-Second World War, some of those people are still alive today. So you've got that kind of mentality, let's say, of kind of scarcity of resource, still kind of sort of prevalent. And then do you think, based on what we're talking about, that maybe in 20 years, maybe a couple of generations down the line, the sort of granddaughters or great-granddaughters, great-grandsons of these initial immigrants, they will kind of adopt less of a scarcity mindset to resource?
Possibly. It's hard to say, isn't it?
It's hard to say.
And I think the thing that I couldn't predict it, but I think there's a difference, isn't it? Is that, even if you are excessive, I think younger generations much more committed to understanding climate change. And so the mechanisms of how they're going to revert back to that, rather than in a kind of lineal biological thing, but more as a collective action. I think what those strategies are of how people become more resourceful, and we're always seeing it in the fashion industry. We're seeing young people quite happily just buy things, even if they have got money, but they'll go to thrift shops because they feel it's much more environmentally sustainable rather than be buying fast fashion. So there is a shift that's already happening, even if people have got the money, about what they should be doing and what they shouldn't be supporting. How that manifests, I couldn't say. And I think it's also, if you carry your parents' beliefs about how to manage your money and your life and your values, but you might not, so you might turn and have a different set of values that aren't carried. And the way that gets constructed is very personal as well. So, yeah, I think it's a fluid system.
Yeah. I remember we went to Pakistan once in summer, and I decided to take out 2 tissues from the tissue box to blow my nose. And my grandma said, "You're not in England anymore. You can't do that." So it was like, over tissues, but no, I think you're right. That mindset that's changing now towards climate change, towards being more careful of resource. And with fashion, one of my good friends, Patrick McDowell, he's a fashion designer, and his entire brand is on sustainable fashion. So I believe all of his range, if not most of it, is recycled fashion.
And so much is moving in that direction. So I think architecture will similarly take that. We have to. And actually, it's been client-driven. Even when I was in Women in Architecture, when I was talking to women in practices, mostly in London and outside London, often they would say, the client came to the table and said, "I bought this building, I don't want to pull it down, I want to revamp it. I don't think it's environmentally appropriate for us to pull it down. I don't want a new edifice, I want this building to actually be repurposed to work around the things that I want and need it to do functionally." So I think clients are also driving it. It's happening externally, as well as architects taking it on board and being better educated, because all architecture schools now have reuse studios. They didn't when I came here 20 years ago. It wasn't a conversation. I remember even when I offered to do a history course at Oxford Brookes on and I brought this up recently when I was giving a talk somewhere else, about the history of sustainability. And someone said to me, they were an external examiner, he said to me, maybe that would be interesting in Australia where it's hot. But he said, in Britain, we're not really interested in that. And I said, how can you not be interested in it? I was kind of very, I don't understand, we're all in the same world. I know I might be in something a bit hotter. But those things which people really just thought weren't necessarily relevant to everyone have now become very relevant and very important for us. We understand that.
Yeah. Talking about this, what we're talking about here, repurposing spaces, looking at it spatially, right? I had this conversation actually in one of the earlier podcast episodes with a good friend of mine, Callan, and he's just become an architect, and he did his entire sort of thesis on repurposing and retrofit. And what does that do for the quality of spaces? So we were talking about the fact that, well, when a building is built for a specific purpose, if that purpose is flexibility, then does it almost strip away the soul of that place? Does it give it a lack of character? What do you have to say to that? And maybe that's a peripheral issue, but is that something that is a consideration?
I think it depends, doesn't it? If the building needs to be super flexible, then it does become more generic. And it can, but it doesn't have to. I think when you're working with an existing building, you're essentially working with the logic of the previous designer, of the period. So it's a collaborative piece of work already. Whether or not new functions and new ways of working with that building can be devised at this time is, I think, the question. But it could similarly be very flexible. It depends on the kind of building. If it's a load-bearing Victorian building, it has certain limitations. But if it's a post-war building, and the work that we were doing on unfinished buildings were essentially concrete frame, domino frame buildings which were half-finished, which they themselves have innate flexibility in them, even if they were built, in 1955. You strip the facade off it, you can basically strip that thing back to a concrete frame and then repurpose it in a contemporary situation. So it does depend, I think, on what the period in which the existing building was built and how tight its rules are, because, modern buildings repurposed, and I'm talking about post-war structural systems, very, very easy to do, but they still come with challenges. It's not an easy thing to do. So there's a whole new set of skills that we need to learn. And I think they are developing in how we respond to that, because we have health and safety and issues that people didn't have at that time. So there are new factors for this zeitgeist. Very important.
Yeah. Amazing. Igea, how did you get into filmmaking?
Okay, so the first film I made was about this autobiography of Stuart Mackintosh. And I found it a really fascinating medium because it could access lots of audiences that you wouldn't normally be able to access if I was to write an academic paper, obviously. And so when I first made my first film, I started to explore filmmaking in studio, and when we were doing the unfinished buildings studios, we were encouraging students to use animations so that the environmental factors of changing environments could be part of the process. But I've sort of done full cycle now and gone back to making biographical films, and the one that I'm working on at the moment is part of my current research, which I'm doing on work-life balance in architecture, which actually, people think it's not a guidebook about how to get it, because I don't think you can get work-life balance in architecture. I actually say that because it's a profession which is basically based on ridiculously long work hours. If, you want to be successful, most people have the model that they work very, very long hours. Their lives are totally committed to architecture, and they do it until they're in their 90s. And that's the kind of famous architect that we have as the model that we work to. And so I was very interested in looking at how the biography of somebody in their whole life can actually enable them to get a work-life balance, or if they wanted to prioritize other things, how that might become a factor. So I look at this thing which is called cumulative advantage and cumulative disadvantage in your life, where something, which is a sociological theory, which is when things when you get into the right networks, how those networks then just keep cumulative creating advantages for you for an architect. So if you meet a client that keeps coming back with more projects, that recommends you to more, and then how does that work? If you have a partner and you decide to have children and that partner is sharing that load with you so that you're able to keep working, how does that become cumulative advantage? But if in a scenario where something goes wrong and you might not be with that person and so you're single and you're parenting, how does that affect your ability to have any kind of balance between your personal and your professional life? And so the book is really about trying to understand the big, long life journey in relation to where people might be able to turn things around or create advantages from disadvantages, I would say. I then, through the Voices of Women in Architecture conference, wanted to do some work on the women of South Asian background, because the woman that I organised the conference with, who the friend at Cardiff put me in touch with, her name's Dr. Mamoona Iqbal in Lahore. She and I had started to meet very interesting women who had these complex narratives. And now we're making a film which is funded by the Mies van der Rohe Foundation in Barcelona, and it's part of the Lilly Reich Equity in Architecture funding that they've just released. And we're trying to make this film about 3 women that live in the UK or have been educated in the UK, but are of South Asian backgrounds, and then 3 women, of which some are in India and some in Pakistan, to understand their journeys and their trajectories. And it's very much using, I think, a lot of the kind of thinking from the book about phases of your life, like how your schooling constructs you, whether or not your parents have a vision of you becoming an architect. And most of the women say, or the majority of them have said curiously in the interviews, just like me, oh, my father said I should become an architect. I come from a family of engineers, but he thought, and suggested it, and I thought it was a great thing. So then, your partnership, you marry an engineer, how does that then construct the work that you do? Then you stay with that person, you have a long practice for 50 years. How does that construct your identity? But if you're jumping and hopping, how does that enable you in your life? So I think the film is trying to get into perhaps more of a sort of understanding how your particular demography and personal history creates. But the film is really about role modeling, trying to understand people who've overcome challenges and still making really important contributions in architecture, and people who have perhaps had an easier run at it, and then also what they contribute.
It sounds to me like you're sort of sitting at the intersection of architecture, but really psychology and film. And
yeah, sociology and film. I read the 3 simultaneously. And I also think the filming part of it is really important, of how to make somebody feel comfortable and represent them, and the spaces in which you film somebody in. Because that space, if it's their home or their office, that is actually a physical manifestation of their identity. If you go to a project on site, if you meet their clients and their clients are clients that are really enamored with the architect and really get on very well, it's kind of that lightness, and you can see these kind of parallel features. So I think there is a kind of combination of the 3 things, and sometimes I'll drop one and we're working on the other 1 or 2, and then I'll bring one of the other ones in. And I actually find it very fruitful, and that's why I've done a lot of work on transdisciplinary research, because I think by bringing in another discipline, you make yourself think differently. But just by thinking about architecture within architecture, I find it very narrow, very limiting, and it just keeps perpetuating the same way of doing it. And I think if we're going to change in a contemporary world, we need to be working out methods of doing it differently so that we can be incorporating the things that we think are important now.
Fantastic. That's amazing, Igea. Thank you so much for coming on and and it's been a pleasure and so interesting. And hopefully do you want to mention the book?
I'm sorry.
Go for it. Go for it.
Yeah, well, the book that I've been working on since 2016, it's called Work-Life Balance in Architecture. And the book is about understanding how to work in a neoliberal world where we're forced to be productive all the time, and it asks a lot of our energy in our life, and it talks about exhaustion and also I think it's about trying to work out ways that if something's an obstacle for you, that you keep going as an architect, if you feel a really strong drive for it. But then if you don't feel that you're an architect, I also have a part in the book about how those architectural skills could be translated in other directions. But I think a lot of it is about trying to let people understand that it's navigating quite a complex terrain, but also that if you're not as productive and maybe at different points of your life you have challenges, to just keep going so that when you do have the time to be able to do what you need to do, you can do it, because I think they're important contributions to the profession.
I think your contributions are incredibly unique, and the place in which you sit is the conversations that you're having and the things you're talking about is not something that is very common. So I think your contributions are incredibly unique and incredibly important, and so maybe that's a good place to end. I had one final quick thing I wanted to a point I wanted to make on what you said earlier. Do you think as architects, as much as we try to control the use of space or the design of a space, you mentioned earlier, if you're in someone's home, it's kind of their identity, that's kind of their extended character. Do you think that as much as we try to control space and craft and compose space, ultimately that space will always be defined by those who use it, and those who live there?
Absolutely. And I think the book by Jeremy Till called Architecture Depends is a great book, isn't it? Because it basically says to architects, you can't control everything, and you can't control the process. You can be a collaborator within a process, and you can work with groups, how closely do you work with user groups? What's your consultation? But yeah, over time, things change. People change, their needs change. I think the idea of even teaching architects that maybe if you design a building now, it may not even be there for very long, because sometimes if that capital can be optimized in another way, then something that you designed may not be there. And a lot of the women that we're interviewing for the film have talked about great buildings that they designed that are no longer there. They've already been demolished. But actually, the life and death of buildings goes with the life and death of architects, We're not always here. Things change. Things have different requirements with people who own them. And I think respecting that as well is important. Just because you designed something, one, it may not work because you may not have got it right. But I think the other one is their needs change. And because that's a dynamic process, I think making architects think about architecture as something which isn't there forever is actually quite healthy. And I think it's good to diminish the ego culture in a profession.
That I couldn't agree more.
Thanks so much for the opportunity.
No, thank you for your time. Thank you so much.